Next important, historian, there are, in between there are many historians, series of historians. Major historian, I mean, is Polybius. He is a Greek historian and he wrote an account of the Roman conquest of Greece. And his study is simply remarkable. He, while criticizing the early Greek historiography, sets new canons of historiography, which he meticulously himself followed, as for example, the importance of geography in writing history. So he is, dealing with that, and geography, chronology, and realism. These three aspects are the hallmarks of, Polybius's history writing. For example, in accepting the war figures provided in official accounts, earlier annals, he is considering all these three factors. So his objective, as he said, every historian has an objective. We had discussed it in the right in the beginning, in the very first few lectures. So, so far his objective is concerned, he very clearly says that this was to serve as a lessons to Greece. Whatever he is writing is a lesson to Greece. This trend you will find in our, Tarikh-e-Firozshahi of Ziauddin Barni, where he also points down certain objectives behind writing history. Now, his history was very popular among the Romans. You see, he is a Greek historian, but his history among the Romans and has partially survived also, not all the texts. He was born in 200 BCE, Megalopolis, Arcadia, Greece, and died in something around 118 BC. He was a Greek statesman and historian who wrote of the rise of Rome to world prominence. Polybius' History of Rome. Like Herodotus, he is also titling his book as the Histories. So, histories on which Polybius' reputation rests consisted of 40 books, the last being indexes. Books 1 and 5 are extant. For the rest, there are various extracts, including those contained in the collection of passages from Greek historians assembled in 10th century and rediscovered and published by various editors from 16th to 19th century. So, they have, they are in tidbits. Polybius' original purpose was to narrate the history of 53 years, that is between 220 to 168 BC, from Hannibal's Spanish campaign to the Battle of Pydna, during which Rome had made itself master of the world. That is, Rome had risen to prominence. Books 1 and 2 form an introductory part covering Roman history from the crossing into Sicily against the Carthaginians in 204 AD, 204 BC, and including events in various other parts of the world, especially Achaia, between 264 and 220. In Book 3, Polybius sketches a modified plan proposing to add an account of how the Romans exercised their supremacy and to extend coverage to the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. The events of 168 to 146 were related in books 30 to 39. Polybius probably conceived his revision after 146, having by this date completed his narrative down to the end of Second Punic War. At least books 1 and 6 seem to have been published by about 150. There is no information as to when the rest of the work, including the revised plan in Book 3, appeared. Conception of history. What was his concept of history? All historians, according to Polybius, have insisted, I quote from his own book, have insisted that the soundest education and training for political activity is the study of history. and that the surest and indeed the only way to learn how to bear bravely the vicissitude of fortune, is to recall the disasters of others. Only then you learn from it. Practical experience and fortitude in facing calamity are the rewards of studying history, and are stressed repeatedly throughout his work. History is essentially didactic, according to him. Didactic. Pleasure is not to be wholly excluded, but the scale comes down sharply on the side of profit. To be really profitable, history must deal with political and military matters that will retain your interest, and this is pragmatic historia. Pragmatic historia. In contrast to other sorts of history, this he writes in book number 9, passage number 1 to 2. He says the genealogies and mythical stories appealing to the casual reader and accounts of colonies, foundations of cities, and ties of kinship, which attract the man with antiquarian interest. Its nature is austere, though it may include contemporary developments in art and science. He stands in contrast to the sensationalism of many of his predecessors who confuse history with tragedy. In book 2, in which he attacks the Greek historian Phylarchus for practices that might be called unprofessional today, Polybius states, I quote, "A historian should not try to astonish his readers." It's relevant for us today also. His readers by sensationalism, nor, like the tragic poets, seek after men's probable utterances and enumerate all the possible consequences of the events under consideration, but simply record, this is the job of the historian, to simply record what really happened and what was said, however commonplace. For the object of history is the very opposite of that of tragedy. The tragic writers seeks by the most plausible language to thrill and charm the audience temporarily. The historian, by real facts and real speeches, seeks to instruct and convince serious students for all time. So one is temporary, the other is permanent. There it is the probable that counts, even though it be false, the object being to beguile the spectator. Here it is truth, object being to benefit the student. So this attack on Phylarchus is not isolated. Similar faults are castigated in other historians, judged guilty of sensationalism. For example, in book 2, passage number 16, 13 to 15, and book 48, 8, and book 7, 7, 1 and 1 to 2, and book 15, 34, 1-36. These are the passages where you will find what I am asserting. Nor are these their only weaknesses. Many historians are prone to exaggeration, and that too for a special reason. As writers of monographs whose subjects are simple and monotonous, they are driven to, I quote, these are his words, magnify small matters, to touch up and elaborate brief statements, and to transform incidents of no importance into momentous events and actions. Book number 29, passage number 12 and 12.3. He is, asking us to avoid all kinds of sensationalism, and he is giving no room for, sensationalization. What we should do is we should remain closer to the facts. In contrast to such practices, according to him, the universal character of his own theme, which is to narrate how and thanks to what kind of constitution the Romans in under 53 years have subjected nearly the whole inhabited world to their sole government, a thing unique in history. He is referring to the empire. Polybius believed that he had a particular reason for adopting a comprehensive view of history. Apart from his own predilection for such a view, he wrote, I quote, "Hitherto the affairs of the world had been as it were dispersed. Since this date, that is 220 BC, history has formed an organic whole, and the affairs of Italy and Africa have been interlinked with those of Greece and Asia, all tending towards one end. Indeed, only universal history is capable of adequately treating Rome's rise to world power. The historian's synoptic view matches the organic character of history itself." I quote him, he says, "What gives my work is its peculiar quality and is nowadays most remarkable is this. Tische, that is fortune, having guided almost all the world's affairs in one direction and having inclined them to one and the same goal, so the historian must bring under one conspectus or for his readers the operations by which she has accomplished her general purpose. For it was chiefly this consideration, coupled with fact that none of my contemporaries has attempted a general history, which incited and encouraged me to undertake my task." He is giving justification why he opted for writing this universal history. So, the role here allotted to fortune, he is bringing fortune. So, the role here allotted to fortune is somewhat unusual, unhistorical we can say. This will lead to chance. So, for clearly the value of history as a source of practical lessons is diminished if cause and effect are at the mercy of an incalculable and capricious power. Usually, although Polybius uses fortune to cover a variety of phenomena ranging from pure chance to something very like a purposeful providence, much of the apparent inconsistency springs from his use of purely verbal elaboration or the careless adoption of current Hellenistic terminology when he was writing, which habitually made fortune a goddess. Here, however, fortune seems to be a real directive power which raised Rome to world dominion because Rome deserved it. He is saying just in justification. Normally, Polybius lays great emphasis on causality. Causation history we had discussed earlier, causality, and his distinction between the causes of an event, ethai, and its immediate origins, that is archai, is useful up to a point, though it is more mechanical than that of the Greek historian Thucydides and allows nothing for dialectical character of historical situations. An important place in Polybius' work is occupied by his study of the Roman constitution and army and the early history of city in book 6, which he is writing. His analysis of the mixed constitution which had enabled Rome to avoid the cycle of change and deterioration to which simple constitutional forms were liable is full of problems. But it has exercised widespread influence from Cicero's De Republica down to Machiavelli and Montesquieu in the 16th, 17th century. What were his sources of information? What makes him such a reliable historian? Polybius defines that the historian's task as the study and collation of documents, acquaintance with relevant geographical features, which I spoke about earlier, and finally political experience. Of these, the last two, that is geographical features and political experience, are the most essential factors to be studied by historian. And he practiced what he preached because he possessed good political and military experience and had traveled widely throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Nor did he neglect written sources. Indeed, for his introductory books covering the period from 264 to 220 BC, they were essential. For the main part of his history, from 220 onward, he consulted many writers, Greek and Roman, but following precedent, he rarely names them. He had access to private sources, for example, Publius Cornelius Scipio's letter to Philip V of Macedonia, describing the capture in Spain in 209 BC of New Carthage, and a letter of Scipio Nasica to some Hellenistic king about the campaigns of Third Macedonian War. He almost certainly consulted the Archaean Record Office, must have drawn on Roman records for such material as they treat between Carthage and Philip II. It has not been proved that he had access to the Rhodian records. His detailed figures of Hannibal's troop formations and Italy from an inscription left by Hannibal, which he found in the temple of Juno of the Lecinian promontory. Polybius regarded oral sources as his most important and the questions of witnesses as the most vital part of a historian's task. Indeed, this is one reason why he chose to begin with his history at the year 220 BC. Anything else would be hearsay at one remove, a safe foundation for neither judgments nor statements. Style and qualities as a historian. Writing in the 1st century BC, Dionysius of Halicarnassus reckons Polybius among those who have left behind them compositions which no one endures to read to the end. That his successors shared this view of Polybius's style is confirmed by the failure of his works to survive except in an incomplete form. Infelicity of Polybius' Greek, which frequently reproduces the conventional phrases of the Hellenistic chancelleries, familiar from contemporary inscriptions, lies in its awkward use of long and cumbersome circumlocutions, vague abstracts, nouns, pedantic repetitions. These things are, he is marking them. To the scholar, his style is no great, bellabus, no great, obstacle. And though in his anxiety to improve his reader, he frequently moralizes and belabors the obvious. Which is obvious, he will go on writing on that. The perennial interest and the importance of his theme will always ensure him a following among those who can enjoy a historian who is accurate, serious, and sensible, like a person like him, who understands the events of which he writes, and above all, who asks the right questions to these things. So, now next historians, there are many historians as I told you, but we are taking representative cases who have made remarkably, remarkable contributions, which we can't ignore if we are considering the development of historiography of that time. So, next important personality which occurs to us is Plutarch. Very important for our modern history as well. He gives the figures of, how many cavalry was there, how many, chariots were there, and how many elephants were there in the Mauryan army, and how well equipped was Alexander's army. Those things are there, but I will discuss about historical method which we can trace in his writings. Plutarch, born in 46 AD at Charonia, Bootia, Greece, and died after 119 CE. So he was a biographer and author whose works strongly influenced the evolution of the essay as a new genre of historiography. The biography and the historical writing in Europe from 16th to 19th century could trace its origin in Plutarch. Among his approximately 227 works, enormous amount of works, the most important are the Bioi Paralleloi, which is Parallel Lives. Now, this is a very interesting book, in which he recounts the noble deeds and characters of Greek and Roman soldiers, legislators, orators, and statesmen. And the other is Moralia or Ethica, a series of more than 60 essays on ethical, religious, physical, political, and literary topics. Now, let us take the parallel lives. The lives. Plutarch's popularity rests primarily on his parallel lives, whose dedication to Trajan's friend Sosius Senecio, who is mentioned in the lives, Demosthenes, Theseus, and Dion, were designed to encourage mutual respect between Greeks and Romans. By exhibiting noble deeds and characters, they were able to provide model patterns of, behavior. The first pair, that is Epaminondas and Scipio, and perhaps an introduction and formal dedication are lost. But Plutarch's plan was clearly to publish in successive books biographies of Greek and Roman heroes in pairs, chosen as far as possible for their similarity of character or career, and each followed by a formal comparison. Internal evidence suggests that the lives were composed in Plutarch's latter years, but the order of composition can be only partially determined by the subsequent writers. The present order is a later rearrangement based largely on the chronology of the Greek subjects, who are placed first in each pair. In all, 22 pairs survive, one pair being able to, two group of Aegis and Cleomenes and Grachi. And for single biographies, Artaxerxes, the lives display impressive learning. Lives means the parallel lives. His book, it displays, impressive learning and research. Many sources are quoted. In fact, instead of footnotes, he is quoting the sources. Footnote was not at that time, I think, created. It was a later development of European historiography. But, his texts are backed up by quotations after quotations, very long, short, every kind of quotations you will find, meaning thereby that he is referring to varieties of sources to come to a picture. So, many sources are quoted, and though Plutarch probably had not consulted all those at first hand, his investigations were clearly extensive, and compilation therefore must have occupied many years. For the Roman lives, he was handicapped by an imperfect knowledge of Latin. That is the problem with him, which he had learned late in life, because as he explains in Demosthenes, political tasks and the teaching of philosophy fully engaged him during his stay in Rome and Italy. The form of lives represented a new achievement not closely linked with either previous biography of Hellenistic history. In general, his scheme was to give the birth, youth and character, achievements and failures or circumstances of death, interspersed with frequent ethical reflections. But the details varied with both the subject and the avoidable sources, which include anecdote mongers, writers of memoirs, as well as historians. Like modern days, they also face the problem of, gossip mongers. This is what he is referring to. Plutarch never claimed to be writing history. This will seem strange to you, which he distinguished from biography. His aim was to delight and edify the reader, enlighten the reader, and he did not conceal his own sympathies, which were especially evident in his warm admiration for the words and deeds of the Spartan kings and the generals. His virulent and unfair attack on Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 5th century BC, probably sprang from his feeling that Herodotus had done Athens more in beauty or less than justice.